My name's Stuart McCulloch. I'm the CEO of Stewardship, and welcome to this morning's webinar. I'm just going to wait a few seconds as the numbers are still going up slightly, and then we'll get going. If I could just start it in prayer, that's always a good place to get going. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this moment of fellowship as we lift up the local church as your beacon of hope, your chosen instrument in this world. And we hope this morning brings enlightenment, wisdom, encouragement, and support to those who are thinking through what we should best do in leading churches in this season. In your name, amen. Well, thank you for attending. And what we're going to do is we're going to have two pieces of input first and then some questions from a panel, and then we'll repeat that process about 3 times and then have a general discussion at the end. So I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker, Peter Linus, who's going to present a short video reflecting on the survey, particularly on the church and evangelism, followed by some thoughts from Samuel, who led the EIDO team, with some thoughts on giving, and then I'll return with a panel discussion. So first, a short video from Peter Linus. Thank you. Oh, and if you've got any questions, put them in the chat box.
Hi, my name's Peter Linus. I'm the UK Director of the Evangelical Alliance, and I want to talk about the Changing Church Autumn 2021 survey. So we had over 500 church leaders responded, and we had over 1,500 church attenders, so some really robust data, which was fantastic. Some of the headline news was this: over 95% of churches are back in person. That's great news. People are getting back together and meeting in person. Over 61% of churches are still offering online services. And again, that's fantastic in terms of accessibility, perhaps for those with a disability, those who are shut in, those who aren't comfortable going back to church or have COVID, but also really good for those who are not Christians. So we know from other surveys and previous work that we've done that those who aren't Christians would prefer to check out church online before they would go in person. To turn up at a church in person is a big step, a big barrier. So online services offer a great on-ramp for people into church. Some of the challenges though are this: on an average Sunday, church attendance is down by 32%. So again, just to be really clear, it doesn't mean that attendance overall at church is down by that, but on an average Sunday. We know from some of the survey that people are attending different churches. We know that very few have actually left church. So what we have is people are attending less often and they're attending online. Online services are up. But all of that has implications. If less people are showing up on any given Sunday, that has implications around volunteering. And so 60% of leaders said they were struggling with volunteers. It has an impact on finances, and others will be talking more about that. And then in terms of particular ministries, we know that 24% of churches that were offering youth ministry before the pandemic hadn't got those back in October 2021. That's a significant chunk given the importance of children and young people and when they come to faith. When it comes to serving the communities though, people are still offering their ministries, and probably the biggest change is in terms of work around mental health. That's up. And in terms of schools, that's down. That's probably around access. In most other areas, it's consistent. People doing a lot of work around food banks and nutrition, a lot of work around loneliness and isolation. And then when it comes to evangelism, one of the things that we found was, on average, people had spoken to 6 non-Christians in the past 3 months. And that was actually pretty consistent with previous surveys. The biggest barrier, though, when we asked that question, was actually not having relationships with non-Christians. That has been a little consistent in some of the other surveys, but a further challenge is if you're not going to work, you're not meeting people in physical workplace, you're not having the kind of water cooler conversations, perhaps having conversations with people on the train or on the bus on the way in and out of work or at sports clubs. All those things have changed in the pandemic. And so the ability to have those kind of more casual conversations in and around work or other environments has shifted. So we're going to have to be a little bit more intentional about the relationships we have, because we know that friendship evangelism is the most effective way to engage people, to introduce them to Jesus, to build those kind of relationships. And so there is a real challenge around that. So we are in this time of really profound change. The challenge is that less people are showing up at church, and they're doing so less often. We need to wrestle with some of the implications with that. But there are also considerable opportunities. We know from across the board that more people are searching for faith, and we know that people are less convinced and interested in science and in politics and in economics at this moment. They are searching for there's something more. In the early stages of the pandemic, it was really the kind of their own mortality staring them in the face, those constant headlines about the death rates. But still now it's a deeper question about purpose and about meaning in life. And so we need to lean into those opportunities at the same time. So there's challenges, there's opportunities, there's lots more we can say. But this is a profound change for what it means to be church, perhaps the biggest change in a generation. And we need to wrestle with what that means and then lean into what God's saying in this season. Be blessed.
Samuel, would you give us your thoughts on the giving part of the survey?
Fantastic. Thank you, Stuart. Yes, my name is Samuel. I'm one of the co-founders of EIDO Research. For those who haven't heard of us, we help Christian organizations measure and improve impact in society. I will quickly share my screen just to talk specifically about the giving that we were measuring in our online, in our Changing Church questionnaire. Hopefully everyone can see that. One of the questions that we asked was leaders' perception of giving, and how much were they receiving in terms of more or less towards their church. As this graph shows, and maybe unsurprisingly, there's a general perception that both giving has decreased in the last 3 months, a significant decrease for many leaders and a slight decrease for a lot. But the leaders perceive this is going to get worse over the next 3 months. So a large proportion of leaders perceiving a slight decrease, slight decrease over the next 3 months. It's interesting though, when we start to drill down into this data to understand, well, what do churches and leaders have in common that are actually going to be seeing or perceived to have a slight increase in giving over the next 3 months or over the last 3 months. And it's interesting to note that slightly younger leaders, larger churches, more evangelical churches are all saying, or there's more likely that these groups are going to be seeing a slight increase in giving. And specifically that those that are running in-person children's ministry and small groups, that this seems to be correlated with a perceived increase in giving. Likewise, at the other end of the spectrum, with for leaders that are seeing a significant decrease or slight decrease in giving, that they typically are putting on less youth and children's ministry and small groups, as well as they have a higher proportion of their giving coming from credit card or cash as opposed to online platforms, and they're actually also, maybe unsurprisingly, experiencing the biggest decrease in attendance. So attendance numbers of in-person services is correlated with the perceived level of giving that church leaders are experiencing. We also asked this question to members. So we asked members how much are you giving, not in terms of actual financial amount, but are you giving about the same? Has there been a slight increase? Has there been a slight decrease? And as this graph shows, it's generally more positive perception from members. This is probably due to the respondents of church members that were completing our questionnaire, were in general more likely to be giving anyway. But again, we can look into some of the similarities between those who are saying that they might increase in their giving, or that they've actually increased in their giving. And unsurprisingly, again, that those groups, those individuals typically have a higher income, but interestingly are more likely to give through online platforms such as Stewardship, and that this is correlated with an increase in generosity. Lastly, that they're more likely to give to help internal needs of the church, that being one of the main motivations of those individuals that have increased in their giving. Finally, at the other end of the spectrum, those that are seeing a significant decrease or a slight decrease in the amounts that they are giving are typically more likely to come to church to receive. That's been their main motivation to come to church to receive. They have a lower emotional well-being, and they are more likely to prefer church online as opposed to in person, and indeed more likely to attend other churches online. And that's, that these, again, it was worth pointing out that we're not saying that all people who like to attend other churches online, or all people that are likely to prefer church online are saying that they'll decrease in the amount they're giving, but this is more likely to be at this end of the process. But yeah, I invite you to ask questions, and we'd love to discuss this more, but thank you for your time.
Thanks, Samuel. That was really interesting. I wonder, the survey was done before Christmas, sometime before Christmas, and an awful lot's happened in the world since then. Would either Peter or Samuel like to sort of comment on the reactions they've had from the study? What are church leaders saying now, and do they see any differences emerging in the season ahead? Peter, perhaps you'll go first.
Happy to, Stuart. Once I unmute myself, you think you'd have learned that by now. So yeah, I've probably spoken to around 100 leaders in and around this, in either individuals or in group rooms. I think there's a lot of resonance with what the survey found. So many were saying, like, what's going on? Somebody please tell me, is my experience unique? I've spoken to a few other leaders. Is this the same? And I maybe condense some of the stats a little bit to say, one of the things I found in conversation, and we know we sampled a kind of a group who are probably more committed in terms of membership. If I'm asked to do this publicly, what I'll say is, look, 10% of people seem to have changed church. We got that number in this survey, that's about right. 10% have left church, that's higher than we found, but I think we had a more committed group. And 10% just aren't sure, checking in online, leaders don't know, they don't know. And then of the remaining 70%, they're going less often. And that seems to resonate with a lot of leaders. Now, obviously, people experience it slightly differently. Partly they want to know, am I alone in that? Is my experience the norm? And then they're saying, as Samuel was saying around the finance, for example, those who are committed remain committed, perhaps even become more committed, and they're giving and turning up. Those who are on the fringes, who are struggling, who aren't coming out, obviously are less likely to volunteer, and their giving will often, not always, but often fall. So in part, they're saying that, and this has been the biggest change in a generation. The reason we leaned into this was we were giving practical advice about the COVID regs, about the COVID rules, and that was really important. Could you meet? Could you not? What could you do? We love doing that, and people were coming to us as Evangelical Alliance, but we were like, but missionally in behind what's happening in this moment. So we're struggling to share faith. We're struggling to get small groups up and running, struggling to do some of the youth, and we know how important that is for the future generations. If a whole host of churches, 24% aren't offering youth. So then we're wanting to make the tip from saying that's the stats and the info. What can we now do? How do we resource you? Stewardship, EIDO, we're all passionate about the kingdom in this moment. So having identified some of the areas of concern, we want to say, how do we lean in and change the narrative around that? And that's what excites us.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I would definitely add to that a lot of church leaders very understandably are in to some extent can feel quite isolated and in a high level of confusion as to what actually should we be prioritizing in this season. And what type of activities, for example, with a decreasing amount of giving or seeing a decreasing amount of income, what kind of activities can they do to potentially increase that and restabilize? It's definitely not a kind of silver bullet, but the data I think I was showing there a few minutes ago does suggest that moving towards online platform giving is really, really helpful. But also that where possible, running in-person events to re-engage the congregation. I know it's very difficult to do that in a lot of circumstances and situations, but those being two key actions that leaders could prioritize. But yeah, that's just a kind of an initial thought on those.
Thank you. And I'm just going to ask Patrick Regan, who's joined us, who's going to talk more about well-being later. But Patrick, do you have any general thoughts on what's been said so far? And then I'll ask some of the questions that are appearing in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. It's really good to be with you guys. And I think from our experience, we obviously started a charity around mental health a year before COVID hit. And so we've seen an increase in giving. And but as I spoke to leaders across this country, I think that, and people within the congregation, I think money always follows vision, doesn't it? And I always say, let's get the vision right, and then the money will follow. But I think that there has to be a real focus on all the things we're talking about. But I honestly believe that this is a time to re-envision people. That what is God saying? You know, Walter Brueggemann uses this brilliant quote: "To be prophetic, you need to evoke grief at what is lost, but create amazement at what is possible." And we've lost a lot, and we need to evoke grief about that. But there are some amazing possibilities at the moment, and so I think we need to really think that. I think we need to think more coffee shops than sometimes church buildings. I think we need to think about partnership. We all talk about partnership and networking, and then reality, everyone does their own thing. We don't have the resources to keep doing our own thing, and I guess I've been saying, Stuart, you know, that I don't want to bounce back. Why would we want to go back to our pre-trauma selves? Why would we want to go back to pre-Cornviv and do everything the way we used to do it? This is an amazing opportunity to bounce forward. And I think that if we hear God, get the vision right, then people will start to give. And I'm excited about that.
Well, thank you. I'm going to ask some of the questions that are appearing. I'm not sure I'm going to get through them all, but let's get going. I mean, there's a question here about people seeing the Christmas giving going down, and you could almost ask what should people, the big giving seasons are often Christmas and I would say to some extent Easter. And does anybody have a comment on that?
I think it's hard to
go on, Lauren.
I think it's hard to know what to make of that at this point yet. You know, we've got one data point in a sense in December. Obviously the survey was done pre-December, so this past Christmas wouldn't have had an impact on that necessarily. But yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of shifting patterns and lots of uncertainty in data, lots of uncertainty in budgeting. You know, whereas before, you know, you might have had as a treasurer or a trustee a fairly good sense of what's going to come in and what's going to go out in normal times. That's another aspect of uncertainty that churches and church leaders will have to deal with.
Thanks, that's really helpful, Lawrence. The next question is really about if online is the best way for people to check out a church, or is becoming the best way, how can we use it as a way to, I think, an attractional model to bring people into church? Any comments on the emerging roles of online church?
I'm happy to comment a little bit to say, I mean, we've seen a large number of people retaining it. So we know if you go to check out a hotel or a house or all sorts of things, you go online, you have a look around. So a number of surveys have told us that people like to find ways to check something out in advance. So as a way in, as a doorway to come into a church building, to physically turn up is a high bar to get over. So the other ways form a good check-in way. Now, the people who are, I think, doing stuff well around that have got kind of online, I mean, online pastors say that's their full role is too much, but online welcome, people engaging on Facebook or YouTube, wherever it's happening, often asking questions, offering prayer. But quite a lot have seen that converted to people then turning up. So to me, that's a good thing to aspire towards. To hold them online only would be potentially a challenge, and it raises some other questions I see popping up about online as an end. But this is a stepping stone. So for most churches, they're seeing it as an on-ramp. And one of the things is we come away, as more churches are meeting in person, is where are people going to connect? How do we partner genuinely, where maybe they've checked into a larger online church far away from them? And then we're saying, well, how do we connect you locally to something that might be similar? So I think it still is a great stepping stone. It's not going to be for everybody. But I do think it's a good way to then physically turn up in a local community too.
Thanks, Peter. That's really helpful. This one's probably for Samuel. There's a question here about how larger churches have fared relative to smaller ones, and you also made a comment about the nature of leadership. Any comments you'd like to make about that, Samuel, in the data?
Yeah, so one of the correlations was that the larger churches were the ones that were reporting an increase, potentially even increase in giving, or a projected increase in giving. I think that might be related with some of those other variables that are linked with an increase in giving, in terms of being able to move giving platforms to away from just cash-based processes to online processes, and likewise the ability to run ministries in person sooner and earlier. I would say that those are probably more of the driving variables to those churches doing better, but not necessarily ones that I think smaller churches can't mimic or can't also learn from. So I think that that's probably why, but not necessarily a reason why not that other churches can't do the same.
Thank you. And this one's probably for Peter. It's part of a question. I'm trying to be selective to get through in time. How do we encourage people on the importance of to come together again in the end?
It's a great question, and it raises lots of angles. I think we've got to be careful to say online is the same as in person. I don't think it is, but it does do an important job, because I know some respond who cannot get out for various reasons and want to be really careful about that. But we have a theology that's fundamentally at its core about an incarnate, in-flesh, showing up God. And we believe that to be embodied and to connect in that way is really important. I think the biblical text tells us that again and again. So I do think it's a real challenge, because I see a number of questions around that. Like, is online helpful? Yes, as an on-ramp. Is it helpful as a support for families and people in particular situations? Yes. But should it replace the physical meeting and encountering together? I would have real challenges with that, and I would say I don't think so. And in fact, I want to push harder and say, so let's ask really good kind of theological, biblical questions about why. One of the things that is most profoundly done this pandemic, is ask, why gather on a Sunday? And that's a great question, because many of us have just habitually presumed it. No, so what is it? Is it the teaching? Is it the worship? Is it the meeting people? Is it the communion? Is it the gathering? I can worship on my own. I can listen to preaching on a podcast, but there's something about being with other people that shapes my worshiping experience, because we're made in the image of relational God. Now, I'll stop my theological rant there. I'm excited about that, but I do think there's something about meeting in person. But each of us is going to have to wrestle with why that is, and tell better stories of why that's important, what happens in the moment of communion, what happens when we sing together that's different than on our own. But I think something does. I think the biblical story tells us that. I think that's theologically good, without saying there aren't moments where it's necessary to have online for people to come who can't otherwise make it.
Yeah. Stuart, can I just underline that point?
I was going to ask you to.
I think it's so important that the people with the additional needs community have been crying out for us to move online for years. And then what happened was, when able people missed church, we did it within a week, and we all got our stuff online. And I feel like some of the language that we use, you know, I heard on the news recently, well, Omicron is great, isn't it? Because it only affects those that are vulnerable and the elderly. And I'm thinking, the language we use sometimes, we have a whole community here that we need to think through. And for me, it's around that relationship connection. How do we build relationships is actually the bigger question, whether that's online or in person. How do we make sure that actually the most vulnerable people in our society are cared for? Because if you care for the most vulnerable, you're likely to get everyone else as well. And so I think that's the bigger question we need to be asking ourselves. How do we connect relationally? How do we care for the most vulnerable?
Brilliant. I'm working down the questions, but they're coming in faster than I can keep up, so which is a good thing. I've got a couple of questions about giving, which I'm going to ask and answer myself just for speed. Someone asked, is online giving better? I hope we haven't given that impression. I think what we're trying to say in this season, online giving has had advantages just simply because physical cash has been nigh on impossible at certain times. All giving should be an act of worship, and therefore all methods are essentially neutral, and that's from someone running an online giving platform. I think it should bring tools that individual people and churches find advantageous here and there, but we're not saying it's better per se. We're just saying in this season it was a way of churches maintaining their income. And then the other thing is a comment about one-off giving and regular giving. Regular giving is absolutely at the heart of managing a ministry, but I would say that the commentator is saying about what about one-offs? They've seen an increase in those. I think as people has managed their finances in a more tight situation, you find people give when they can afford. So one-off giving becomes a habit in their financial management. I'm going to rattle on so I get through a few more, if you don't mind. Let me just see where we go. I think we've covered quite a lot about online. Here's one. What about rural ministry and smaller aging congregations? Any comments about those? I think that might go to Peter first.
So I'm not aware of specific data that we have in terms of the survey. I know from speaking to people, this links to one of the questions about larger churches. I think the online tended towards and to favor them, but actually in talking to people, one of the challenges for a larger church and one of the benefits for a smaller church is that people do want to start to reconnect and meet together. And actually larger churches that formed kind of attractional services are struggling a little bit with that, just the sheer size and scale of what they operate. And people are kind of going local again. We're not traveling as far for work. We're a bit more locally connected. So for some rural communities, people are wanting to move out of the city. They're wanting to engage more locally. People like me, I'm sitting as a UK director, but in little town Portstewart in Northern Ireland, far away from London, and spending a lot more time locally than I did prior to the pandemic. So some of the smaller congregations I'm speaking to are seeing that increase of people connecting locally on the ground. Their neighbour is not their work colleague in London or in the Belfast office or in Manchester or the big city. It is their literal neighbour who during the pandemic they got to know better. And so I do think some of those smaller congregations are thriving, but some are really struggling, because if you didn't have critical mass and momentum and you're older and your congregation is not returned, you're going to struggle. And we'll have to make some bigger calls about how we do church, what models are going to go forward, what churches can come through this. If you had an older, more nominal congregation that's not coming back, those are some of the tougher decisions. If it's right that less people are attending church, there are some tough calls ahead. I always want to get that balance. It'd be naive to think there's nothing changed, but I also want to be excited about the opportunities that presents. But that's hard for the individual churches concerned.
The only thing I would just add on to that is that it's not necessarily just younger congregations, but younger leaders are the ones that are perceiving an increase in giving, whereas the older the leader, unfortunately, the more significant the reduction in giving, and that's something else to probably factor in when thinking about the age profile of a church. It's the age of the leader can be also just as influential in this instance.
Fantastic. I know there's loads of questions that have come in. We're going to have another question session in a little while, but just so we can cover all of the ground, I'm going to introduce a new speaker. We'll go through that, and then we'll have another session, and I will go back and make sure we ask as many of these questions as possible. There's some fantastic ones coming through. We will aim to get through all of them during the course of this, but I'd just like to introduce Laurence Duplessis, who's who leads our accounts examination team in Stewardship, and he's just going to try and draw out some of the themes around leadership and governance that came out of the survey. Then we'll have another question, and I'll start with some of the later questions from this first session. Laurence.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Hopefully, after this little session, we won't think that governance is just fundamentally a compliance exercise, or one of those words that you hear in one of these webinars and then switch off when you hear it. I think it's important to recognize upfront that governance is not fundamentally a compliance exercise as we think about the changing church post-COVID from a governance perspective. I think very often in a church governance, church leadership context, we reduce that concept to things like filing accounts on time with the Charity Commission, or making sure we've got safeguarding and data protection policies and risk assessments in place. As important as all of those things are. But like the book of Esther, which doesn't actually name God, but is all about him and his providential care, this survey doesn't mention the word governance. And yet it is all about governance. Governance is fundamentally about stewarding the resources, the people, the money, the buildings, opportunities, the structures of the church well. And all of these are impacted by the effects of COVID-19 and the already changing landscape around it in which the church is situated. So let's just consider a couple of the impacts highlighted by this survey. Finances, we've spoken about that. Decreased giving and decreased regular attendance means trustees may need to reassess plans for expansion, for new ministries, and perhaps take significant steps in reducing costs. Maybe underlying problems that have been masked by irregular giving have now surfaced. What level of reserves should the church keep now? More reserves to buffer against increased uncertainty, or accept lower reserves to carry it over during times of hopefully temporary decreased giving? Either way, we can't as trustees just assume that business as usual is going to cut it in the post-COVID church. Next, with our governance structures. And here we're not just talking about trustees, but also other leaders like elders, deacons, and so on. What do we do when regular attendance goes down, when people who fill these roles are stretched already due to others needing to step down from their volunteering roles? Firstly, our trustees and other church leaders need care. Leaders report in the survey an increased level of emotional wellness from a year ago, but there's a disconnect there with many stories we anecdotally hear of, or people we know personally. And that raises the question from a governance perspective. If governance is also about stewarding people well, then there's a proactive task here. Do we recognize that good governance means looking out for those God has set over the church and for their emotional, physical, and spiritual health? It needs to be on our governance agenda more than ever. Secondly, governance structures may be depleted after the pandemic. People moving churches, which we've seen, people not attending their previous churches anymore, but also people needing to step back for a season, perhaps to focus on health and families and similar concerns. We've got a drop in volunteering, although church leaders see a more significant drop than the volunteers themselves, as reported in the survey. Volunteering includes governance structures, not just the welcoming or creche or tea and coffee rotas. Churches might need to think about replenishing their trustee bodies and think of creative ways, perhaps, of bringing expertise on board where that expertise is not available anymore. And one immediate step might be involving advisors on key areas, even if they can't take up the role as trustee. There are, of course, also new opportunities. And churches have been at the heart of meeting practical needs in their communities and demonstrating God's love and care in a very real way, for example, with food banks. Now, in many cases, these developed spontaneously and grew organically. But asking the right governance questions means we need to think longer term too. If these activities have grown significantly over the course of the last 2 years, may they now need their own dedicated leadership and governance arrangements? And might that free the church's leadership to focus on their very crucial task of responding to the very real needs we've seen highlighted in this survey? Might the governance challenge now be, in fact, to regain focus, depth, not breadth? And there aren't any hard and fast answers here, except that the answer is not just to be carried forward in the status quo. Governance is anything but static and boring. It requires dynamic leadership and responding to the needs facing those God has called to these roles at this time. There are hard but crucial questions facing those charged with governance in churches. But we dare not shrink from facing those questions. Queen Esther was challenged with a question, and who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And I believe God has called those charged with governance in our churches exactly for a time such as this. Thank you.
Thanks, Lorenz. Lots of food for thought there, and please start putting more questions into the chat. However poor I am at asking them, there's some fantastic questions coming through. Patrick, do you have a comment on this? It's been really tough to lead and govern in this season. Do you have any comments you would give on this season of leadership, Anna?
Yeah, it has been really tough. I feel like I've spoken to lots of leaders, and I feel like that sometimes it's a bit like, some leaders have said to me, it's a bit like running a marathon, and you finish the marathon, and then someone slaps another number on your back and asks you to go again, but just with less resources, and the tank gets lower and lower, doesn't it? And I think, again, I just feel that supporting our leaders, the culture of leadership, if we define, and thinking about leaders in our country, if we define culture as the way we do things around here, then actually, you know, I know Simon Barrington in his book around millennials is saying the 3 things that people are looking for in leaders is passion, humility, and integrity. And I really feel like it's an amazing time to really look at what our values are as churches, as organizations, because I feel like we want to be value-based leaders where, you know, our values are our priorities. So, you know, and the way we do things around here. And I think that our values should inform our decisions more. So, you know, I know for Kintsugi Hope, we have a big value on relationship. So every decision we make, if that's not making a relationship connection, then why are we doing it? And Susan David, I think, said that values are like a compass that helps you move in the right direction. And I think our values have changed as a culture. I think our low-skilled workers became our key workers within a week. You know, Christian Eriksen lays on a football pitch, struggling to breathe. Suddenly football doesn't matter in the Euros. It's health, it's family, it's relationship. And so making, you know, having a conversation, what are our values, I think is really important in governance, in trustees, and in leadership teams at the moment.
Lovely. Peter, what would you add to that?
Totally agree. And I think governance is really important in this season. A lot of people serving in those leadership roles are on various, maybe lead or serve on boards in various places. And maybe one of them's in a crisis at any one time. And you can cope with that. Now suddenly everyone's in a perpetual crisis, and the 3 or 4 things that you're in your own work, maybe your church, maybe another charity, are all looking more of your time and attention. So there's a challenge in that. Somebody was asking, I think one of the previous questions, where do you see things in 2, 3, 5 years time? I don't have the answer, but that's the sort of thing boards and leaders and governance are often wrestling with. I think that's huge. And so we're looking at a kind of small scale, practical. Do we need masks? What's the rules for our church? What policy do we have? But actually, the hard work that we're trying to carve out the time for is, where is it in 2 years, 3 years, and 5 years? Is online church, what resource does that take to do it well in the way we want to do it? So it's not just live streaming this little bit. If we're going to do it, are we going to do it in this way? What does that mean? What's the commitment? How do we serve our community? What does that mean? So I love governance, and I think it asks really fundamental questions. And we often had structures that were designed for the past era and we're already coming to an end. We've done some practical changes, but I think some of the more substantive, like, how do we redefine governance so that we're looking to release moving forward? It's going to continue to change. There's no going back to what was before, as others have said. I totally agree. And the easy thing is going to be the default, and that's not going to work. In fact, it's not even going to be an option for most of us because it's so profoundly different there. So we're going to have to make really tough calls around finances, around meeting. Like, why do we gather on a Sunday? What does it look like? How are we going to reimagine what our church looks like to be more missional, to reach out into the community, ... That's exciting, but really challenging for others. So you need probably new board, new life, new blood that's got energy to take you into that space. So again, I think it's a really excellent opportunity to reframe what leadership, boards, governance, trustees look like in this moment. And I'm excited for that, but I get that it's draining and taxing if you're doing it.
Yeah, Stuart,
Samuel,
Stuart, yeah, Stuart, can I just pick up on something that Peter said there? And that's this whole thing about a new generation of leaders, a new generation of those who take on the governance role. It's a fundamental for me in many cases. And in fact, as you well know, here in Northern Ireland, we have started the Stewardship Emerging Trustees training because we want to catch those who are the 20-somethings to 30-somethings who someday will get a tap on the shoulder and asked to take on that role. But I think now is the time, because we are in this time of change, whenever churches and those who are responsible for governance should be looking and saying, who are the younger people in our congregations who will be taking on this mantle? Because we're going to have to take it on earlier than what they probably would have done in the past. And how do we prepare them for that? How do we take them in as an apprentice, a trustee, for example, to learn and to be able to input? And I had a really amazing conversation with somebody a couple of weeks ago, who was saying that they were talking about international money transfer for the support of missions. And there was somebody sitting around the table with them, and they were saying about, well, as we all know, international transfer of money is becoming more and more difficult, and the banks are getting very tight, and some governments are getting even tighter. And one of the young guys around the table said, well, have you ever thought of cryptocurrency? Now, for those of us who are in the sort of plus 50s, plus 60s and beyond, cryptocurrency is something that's a way out over there. But to the younger generation, the ones who are in their 20s and 30s, that's real life. And I'm all for it. So I really come in there and support where Peter was coming from, that time of dynamic change is also a time for us to embrace some youth. And I would encourage churches to say, who are we going to identify and who can we bring on board?
Well said, Philip. Samuel, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with everything that's being said here, and I think it's actually a lot of the people that we've worked with as an organization, churches, have been going on this journey, but crucially going on it as a whole congregation. And this is where just even as something as simple as circulating, just as a practical step, an online or paper survey with your congregations, just saying, hey, let's take this moment to stop and pause and almost rethink how we go on this journey together. And then follow that up with focus groups, and you won't be surprised to hear me talking about research here. But I think it's a really exciting opportunity for church leadership to stop and listen to where the congregation's at, to where we're at as a community, and then crucially then go on that conversation, that journey together, rather than necessarily just doing it in the upper echelons of leadership. Yeah, we certainly had a lot of really exciting conversations around that.
Excellent. I'm seeing some very positive reactions in the chat box about this shifted generation and in the diversity of leadership. Again, we find ourselves slightly time constrained, so I don't want to put off too much, but one last thing, we talked an awful lot about the church. Would anybody like to make a comment about the role of events and charities who are looking at a kind of broader canvas above the local church, and any comments they'd like to make briefly on those? And we'll probably revisit this later. Perhaps Peter, would you mind saying something?
So I am in family business as well. So I say that just to say, like, so the landscape and everything is changing, and everybody's having to reimagine what it looks like. And I do think for events, there's a real challenge. That was a really key part of particularly the evangelical church world for the last 50 years. I heard somebody give a talk about this, that we built actually pretty effective models and bridges that worked for the last 50 years. And I've actually done a pretty good job in terms of the church and events and youth ministries and things around them. And there's a big question: has this moment really shifted the goalposts? Has it moved the river? The analogy is used of a bridge that was built, an incredible bridge, and then the river moved to the side. And I wonder, or someone's going to have to ask that more profound question. That's why governance and boards are important, because is the thing that we do needed in the same way, or do we need to reimagine? So what is the purpose of that event? The event has been a good way of getting that purpose to date. Now we're saying, what's our purpose? Is it to disciple people? Is it to release young people? Is it to celebrate? What is it? And might we need to reimagine how we do that? That might be events. It might be smaller events. It might be more localized events. But it does drive us back to the why do we do it purpose question. And then the output, the event, or whatever it is we do, might look different in that moment. But I think always being driven back to the why question. That's a Simon Sinek one. Start with the why. Why were we doing the thing in the first place? Because people get fixated on, I can't do the event for 2,000 people right now. And I want to know, what is it we're trying to do? And let's find a new way to do that.
Very helpful, Peter. I'm going to move on to the final piece of input, and then we're going to have a fairly sizable moment for questions. But it's really, I'm going to introduce Patrick Regan again, who's going to show a short video, a thought piece, and then we're going to go back to him for our first few comments, and we'll go from there. But we have plenty of time left to go back over the questions when we reassemble. Patrick.
Hey, it's Patrick here from Kintsugi Hope. I've been asked to speak on the well-being of church leaders and their church members, and what we can be doing to help ourselves and the communities from Kintsugi perspective in 4 minutes. So here we go. For church leaders and church members, I could give you a nice long list of you need to eat well, exercise well, and all the lists that you've probably seen online. But for me, I found 3 C's really helpful in the way that I think about well-being. And the first one is simply this, is curiosity. Get curious about the way that you're thinking. Get curious about what your thoughts and emotions are trying to tell you. As leaders, we're making quick decisions on limited info. People seem hypersensitive, don't they, and emotionally charged. There's a big staff turnover in many churches. Our minds can feel overloaded. We're still tired from a draining year. So the key is this, is don't believe everything you think. Our emotions and our thoughts are really important data telling us what's going on. Sadness is a really important emotion. It tells you that actually you're really sad about something because something really matters to you. Anger isn't a bad emotion. Anger is an emotional response to pain. There's been an injustice. So my first tip is get curious about why you're thinking the way you're thinking. What is that emotion? What is that thought trying to tell you? Second C is compassion. I used to hate the term self-compassion. I felt like it was navel gazing. It was just about being selfish. I'm an activist. I want to change the world. And then I realized this, that self-compassion is not the same as self-indulgence. Self-compassion isn't about giving yourself endless pleasure, extra chocolate, no discipline at all. Self-compassion is not self-pity. Self-compassion is not self-esteem. They're very different things. Self-compassion is this, is talking to yourself the way that you would talk to your best friend. I am my own biggest critics. I criticize myself all the time. Are we quick to forgive ourselves when we make mistakes? Or do we pile on the pain? Do we say it's okay not to be okay? We all have limitations. In fact, accepting our limitations is a sign of maturity. God designed us with limitations. Compassion. Self-compassion is talking to yourself the way you talk to your best friend. And thirdly, courage. Brené Brown, the famous research professor, says this: courage and vulnerability are the same thing. Brené Brown, she says the Latin word for courage is cur. It means to speak your mind with your heart and let your true self be seen. Mary Ann Ratcher says courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet voice that says, I'm going to try again tomorrow. So have courage. Ask for help. We're not built to be lone rangers. We need to go gently. We need to be kind, and we need to stay connected in the best ways that we can to other people. How do we support our communities? Well, 3 or 4 years ago now, Kintsugi Hope's formed, and we started a charity that wanted to train churches to deliver a 12-week well-being program in their community. A well-being program that looks at issues like anger and depression and anxiety, written in learning styles, delivered on Zoom, delivered in coffee shops and pubs. And before COVID, we were so excited. We trained 40 churches, and we thought, this is incredible. COVID hit, and I thought, we're doomed. And we moved all the training online. This map now shows where we're working. It's gone everywhere. Our churches we're working with are incredible, reaching out to their community. The stories are incredible. People after the 12 weeks coming to faith, coming back to faith. People with suicidal thoughts actually going on to get jobs. You know what? I believe as we invest in our mental health and emotional health, things change. We all invest in our physical health, hopefully, but investing in your mental and emotional health is absolutely vital for you as a leader and your members and as a community. Kintsugi Hope is there to serve, it's there to help, and not to be the be-all and end-all, but to come alongside and to work with churches and their leaders to create positive futures. God bless you.
Thanks, Patrick. Do you want to add anything, given the flow of discussion and questions, to what you said in the video?
Yeah, I guess we've done some research recently around what makes a mental health friendly church, and it was really interesting. We did it with Theos, and one of the things that came out for me was 91% of church leaders said that they've never received any training in mental health, theological training. It wasn't mentioned at Bible college. And what was coming across is that people were going, you know what, we've got this massive issue in society, and yet we're making it up as we go along. We're flying by the seat of our pants, if you want, and feeling completely and overwhelmed at the same time. And so I think how we train our leaders, how we support leaders in this area of mental and emotional health is so important. I think also the thing to say, just briefly, is people looking at the Mental Health Foundation statistics recently, 40% of people are still not coping well, which is huge, actually. And sometimes I feel like it's a bit like, the scenario where soldiers went to war, and it's when they came back, when the war was over, that actually the trauma started to come out. And I think that we will start seeing that as well in our communities, which I think is, so we need to be there for them. And I think the last thing I'd want to say is just really gently, I think sometimes we've made evangelism about selling Jesus to people. And what I've noticed in some of our Kintsugi groups, that when we talk about how Christ meets us in our weakness and our anxiety and our depression and trying to work out how to do life with kids, I've got a kid with an additional needs, and how do we do this thing called life, and how Christ meets us in that, things start to change, and people, actually really appreciate that authenticity. Just one really quick story. There was a charity running a Kintsugi group, and they got to week 6, which is on perfectionism. And the non-Christians in the group went, well, we just thought you Christians were a bunch of do-gooders. You just got loads of rules and you want to follow them. But for the last 6 weeks, you've talked about your frailty and your vulnerability and how your faith meets you within that. You've totally changed our view on Christianity. And I think sometimes there's a temptation, isn't it, to have it all together. But what we've been trying to say is actually mental health is a leveler. And I feel that we can just have the honest conversations in groups, in communities. We can start to see change. And I think that's what's starting to happen.
Thank you for that. Peter, would you like to comment on this area?
Yeah, well, interestingly, when we did this survey, I remember as the results came back in, I think this was November, well-being was essentially quite flat and consistent with previous surveys. And it was the one question that we all went, I don't trust the data on that. As in, anecdotally, we were hearing something to the contrary. We were hearing the stories. And for whatever reason, people are either self-assessing or putting in scores. Now, we didn't feel that we could push back against that data directly in the response to survey, but it was interesting. Everybody in the room went, that's not what I'm hearing. And I think part of that is two things I'd say. Beyond our margin is limited, so that extra space that we all have where we can deal with something coming in, that's kind of gone forever. We've used all our margin the last 2 years. So for leaders, for parents, for school teachers, wherever it is, there's no extra capacity left. And so it takes very little to tilt people. And so you end up in these more fractious conversations or people struggling. And the other thing I'd say is, I think, as I've talked to people, and the thing I sense kind of God saying in this moment is, this is the season for the pastoral and the prophetic. And those that are leaning into that combination in particular, I think, that's an incredibly powerful thing. So again, that maybe goes to our larger church, the smaller previously. It's not a binary, but often you'll find the pastoral in a smaller environment is easier to manage. It's a bigger deal and much tougher in larger churches. So, but anyway, those who are leaning in the pastoral, but also the prophetic, because this is an ever-changing season, we've got to be listening to what's God saying and responding. I think if you do either of those on their own, that doesn't work. My sense really in the next 5 years, somebody's asking that question. That's the place churches need to be leaning into in terms of what God's saying, because we have a society that is desperately looking for that kind of pastoral support and help. And most of our friends have nowhere to turn to get that. We at least have a church community, sometimes leaders with some level of training, noting what Patrick said, that it's nowhere near what it could be. And then we look a little differently at what's coming, and the fear and the anxiety, the challenge around youth and relationships, the schools, everything that's going on, the level of fracturing. We're going to have to lean really differently forward into that space prophetically as well.
Yeah. And I'll just say, Stuart, the opportunity with things like social prescribing, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it, and where GPs can socially prescribe to a church, to a kintsugi group, to a food bank, to whatever that church is doing, is huge. I remember my chair rang me up and he was talking to just Ipswich social prescribers, and they were like, we have 500 people we can socially prescribe to you next week. And that's 500 people who've gone to a GP and gone, I need help. But what an amazing opportunity. 500 people who may not necessarily connect to a church, that are longing for some sort of community, were longing for some sort of connection. I've often said, I think the church has the best structure. We're in every community across this country, and with all respect to the government, we were out last 5 years, and we'll be there for our non-members as well. And so it's an amazing opportunity. And I think that whole area of social prescribing, working with what people are doing, is really, really important at the moment.
I couldn't agree more. I don't know how quite to sort of join in as the sort of chair, but there was a very important moment for me just before Christmas where I was at Kingsgate Church in Peterborough, which is a very large church, and there was about 300 or 400 church leaders just in a quiet, prayerful moment of safety and vulnerability. And I think it's in spaces like that, rather than in surveys, that we can say it's been tough to our peers, to those that have an empathy for what it's been like to be in these frontline roles. And I think it was a great honouring of those who have done so very, very much for their communities, their churches, their charities, and other things to honour that in that way. And I think that's a little bit more, as a data point, I felt that was slightly more reliable than the survey, because I think I'm always, when I'm ever asked, I say I'm fine. I'm not sure I always am. And you need a moment and a framing of that, I think, to do it justice. On that comment, I just wanted to sort of perhaps move on to our last provocation, if that's okay, in that we asked Krish Kandaya to give a piece of input to this session. And those of you who know Krish know that he's a bit of a moving target these days with Afghan Hope, Hong Kong Welcome, and his work with the government. And I just thought we'd bring that voice to bear. And we've worked quite closely with him, which he's been quite enthusiastic about. And this sort of answers one of the questions that came up, you know, how can the local church look up? And I think one of the things we've been trying to work with Krish on is, well, here's how we can look up and out. And so we're going to show you a very short video with Krish's infectious enthusiasm, and then we're going to go to a final and longer question and answer session, if that's okay. Krish.
Hi everybody, it's Krish Kandaya here, and I'm delighted to be speaking to you today about the incredible work that Stewardship's philanthropy team has made possible in mobilising the church to two really huge opportunities for the grace of God to be shone to some people in need. These two opportunities are UKHK and Afghan Welcome. Both of them were only possible by the quick thinking of the Stewardship team. Basically, I was leading a charity called Home for Good, and then I got called to work for the government in adoption reform. That left 4 days of my week open, and I wasn't quite sure what I was going to be doing. And then the UK basically opened its borders to up to 130,000 people from Hong Kong arriving in 2021. This is one of the largest planned migrations to the UK from outside of Europe in a generation. In fact, the previous time this number of people came to the UK was the Windrush generation. And I don't know about you, but that sent shivers down my spine. 50 years of injustice and discrimination have had a terrible consequence on the nation, but particularly on people from the Caribbean. And I wanted to reverse that and see if the church could be at the front of the queue to make sure people from Hong Kong got a welcome. And so that was possible because of three big things that we were able to do together with Stewardship. And I want to talk to you about agility, story, and empathy. Basically, the team at Stewardship were able to act really quickly. While this stuff was kind of going on and it was in the public imagination, we were able to get busy. We didn't want to start a new charity, so we started a new funding pot, and then we were able to bring charities to work together in cooperation. Charities that had never worked together before were able to come around the table, figure out how each part of the jigsaw could work together so that we could bless loads of people from Hong Kong. And you know what? Over 500 churches stepped forward, 4 different charity organisations working together, and we were able to release the church to go and get busy making sure Hong Kongers felt welcome in the UK. And we had Baptists and Anglicans and Catholics and you name it working together in order to make that possible. And that was all because of Stewardship's agility. The second thing we were able to do quite quickly was do some really good storytelling. We found out what it was like to come to the UK. We amplified the voices of recent arrivals from Hong Kong, and we allowed those stories to be told at the highest levels. We were able to organise a roundtable for Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, and to tell their stories in the press. We were on the front pages of the Hong Kong press because of the work that the church was doing. It was fabulous. We were able to say, look what the church wants to do. We are a community of welcome and of love and of compassion, and it's our delight to offer practical service to new arrivals from Hong Kong, and it was just amazing. So we were able to be agile, we were able to tell stories, but thirdly, we were able to build empathy. We helped people get into the shoes of what it was like to arrive from Hong Kong. We told people, look, this is the largest planned migration to the UK from Europe in a generation. We told people that it's really tough to move continents at the best of times, but even harder in the middle of a pandemic, and even harder when there's been a spike in race-based hate crime. And then we made sure people heard the stories so they could relate to them of what was going on for Hong Kongers. So, for example, I was speaking at a church not long ago, 2 services, in between the 2 services, a lady came up to me and she said, look, I gave up on Hong Kong. I gave up on Jesus 30 years ago in Hong Kong. But because of the welcome of this church, I've decided to find Jesus again, to start a new relationship with him. And I want my husband to do the same. This church had done an amazing job. They'd gone and put themselves on the UKHK website. They'd made sure that there was Fun Ying written on their webpage. And even as people arrived at the church, on the t-shirt of the welcome team, Fun Ying was written. They've seen dozens and dozens of Hong Kongers arrive, and some of them are finding faith. That is brilliant, isn't it? Now, you might say, Krish, that's all very well. What about Afghanistan? Well, here's the quick take on that. It was because the church got active and offered this welcome to people from Hong Kong that the government came to us and said, thank you for what you've been doing. We'd like you to do the same for Afghanistan. And that has been absolutely the same playbook. We were agile again, quick fund of money coming together, bringing charities together, not starting a new one. Secondly, lots of storytelling. We're on the front pages of newspapers. We've been on the BBC and Sky, and building empathy, helping people experience what is it like to arrive in the UK from a war zone like Afghanistan. All of this has only been possible thanks to the incredible work of Stewardship. We've helped literally 2,000 children and their families receive the clothes that they need and the support they need. We've seen 700 churches get involved in some way across the UK. It's been absolutely fabulous, and it's all been paid for out of the generosity of God's people. Over £1 million, I think, has been raised one way or another for Afghanistan or for UKHK. Thanks so much. If your church isn't involved in what we're doing, please get in touch, and hope to meet you again soon. Thanks.
Thanks, Krish. I think it's worth saying he slightly oversold Stewardship's involvement in all of these things. I hope we were helpful. But I think the important thing is we were trying to get out of that video was a number of things are happening where the local church acts collaboratively with others, and what we actually get is a much bigger effect. So if you take Afghan Welcome, that's ourselves, Krish's organisation, Welcome Churches, a number of other organisations, I can't list them all, who just got together very, very quickly, and we were able to respond to something happening very much in real time. Forming a charity takes about at least 6 months these days, whereas often responses are needed much more quickly. And I think the church has shown this in the COVID season with what it's done on vaccination and other things. So we were just trying to shift the energy there to there are things that the church is doing which are of a very, very significant scale, where it is thinking outward and upward. Any comments on that, Peter or Patrick?
I mean, apart from saying Krish has fantastic energy, I think the connectedness of like Home for Good and then into both Hong Kong, Afghanistan, there are great opportunities. The government has ultimately got limited capacity and resource. As Patrick said earlier, it's looking for networks to have outposts, for want of a better word, for our churches in every town and community. And so actually in a whole range of places, Stuart, you and I were in meetings recently with Church Works Commission, another group that you're involved in, Evangelical Alliance is involved in, again saying to government, look, we want to partner with you, church. We want to help some of the issues going on in society. We have an incredible network. We have a long, long history. And so in so many ways, yes, we have struggles with capacities and volunteers like everyone has, but actually the church is really well placed in some of these initiatives. And when we pull together like that, it is incredible what we can do in ways in which government often can't, or we can partner better together in it.
Patrick?
Yeah, no, definitely. I totally agree with what Pete says, and I love that agility, story, and empathy. That was absolutely fantastic. I think that I described it to someone once. A friend described it to me like this: that if you got cancer, you expect the hospital to give you chemo and radiotherapy, and but to get through a cancer journey, everyone will know that you also need love, community, and support. And I don't think, like, I know from mental health perspective, but from other perspectives as well, we can't do what mental health professionals can do. We can't always do what the professionals could do, what the government could do. But you know what? We can offer love, community, and support. And I know through a lot of my research is actually what people really need in at this time is what we describe as a gentle presence. And I really love that term. I think that's a really lovely term, because gentleness is strength. Actually, we think it's like weakness, but it's not. I think people want a gentle presence in their lives, and that's why, looking at some of the questions, you know, people thinking about setting up cafes, people coming alongside people, and through that, people get to know Jesus. And I saw another question. So, you know, what about well-being and evangelism? Well, I've known people to come to faith in the last 6 months as people have come and shared their vulnerabilities and shared their heart, and they've met Jesus in that. And I sort of feel like the spiritual health, physical health, emotional health, mental health, they're actually all interweaving circles. And so often we've separated them. But what the church does is say we want to care for the whole person, and all these things are important. And I think that's really vital.
Thank you. I mean, just going back to Peter, there's a question or a comment really around if you contrast the gentle presence that Patrick rightly talks about, and community and other things, with some of those kind of slight barrier issues that we've had in the public square around how the church has been cast over the past few decades. How do you think we attack that, those conceptions and misconceptions?
It's a great question. Probably not by attacking per se.
Sorry,
but
bad word. I apologise.
No, sure. Sorry, I don't want to pick on that word.
I'm Scottish, not Irish.
the cultural war piece, sometimes that language is unhelpful. But at the same time, so I'm certainly not running away from those issues, and I find it fascinating to have conversations. We've launched a Being Human project, and some of the work that we do within Evangelical Alliance. What does it mean to be human? It seems that most profound question, from Black Lives Matter to the vaccine rollout. Who gets it? Whose lives matter? Who are we going to go out and clap and celebrate during a pandemic? And I ask these kind of very profound questions. And yet at the same time, climate change and sexuality and the beginning end of life also ask those questions. And we have a story that we inhabit. It says people are absolutely made in the image of God and matter. So how we frame that, I think, is incredibly important. For me, that doesn't change my understanding of some of those core issues, my desire to engage in the public square around them, involved in conversations on some of the more difficult issues like conversion therapy, but equally passionate as Christians about how we open up our homes to foster and to care for those who are coming from different cultures and contexts, and to make sure that we're offering thriving pastoral support and mental health and well-being. I think that's absolutely consistent with what Jesus did. He challenged people in the public square while at the same time welcoming in the least and the lost. And he held those things together, not in tension, not picking on you, attacking people, but provoking them in the way he did life. So I think it's perfectly possible to do, but it does require a little bit of thought and new ways of thinking. And actually in this moment, again, the government is more open to us having these conversations because it realizes it needs groups like the church that are prepared to do the hard yards over the long term with people wrestling with all sorts of questions and issues.
Something that I would just add to that, though, of course, was that quite infamous study that was now done in the UK about 4 years ago that showed, I think it was 40% of the British public didn't think that the UK church added any value to society. Just such a condemning figure given the amount of stuff that the UK church already does. And I think, I would just reiterate that, again, we've had an amazing opportunity, and we still have an amazing opportunity to really be much more outward facing and adapting and meeting those needs of local communities. One of the really exciting findings from our impact evaluation of the Rapid Response Fund, of Stewardship's Rapid Response Fund, was just the correlation between church's external impact, adapting, how many activities were they doing to adapt to the local community needs, partnering with other local community organizations, and the positive image that they were sharing and creating with their local community. Just anecdote and story after story of transformed perception of what the church can and to some extent should be doing by local communities was, yeah, just really encouraging.
I think the challenge on that, Stuart, is often the way that Christians have engaged in politics has been around, let's protest about this and let's protest about that. And I think Jim Wallace has this really interesting quote. He says, protest is good, alternatives are better. And I think it's around building relationship, actually. And it's interesting that you know, we're mourning the death of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and I got the privilege of meeting him and stuff. And it was fascinating that even when he was in his late 80s, there probably wasn't a president in the world that wouldn't turn up to meet him at the airport or have at least a conversation with him when he was in the country. And towards the end of his life, he had no power whatsoever, but his life screamed integrity and passion for the poor and the marginalized and the broken. And I feel like that if we can build relationships, if we can do what God's called us to do, you know, I've talked to so many MPs, and they say, you know, some of the nastiest letters I get are from Christians who claim to speak for God. And sometimes inviting these guys out to see what we're doing, invite them to the food bank, invite them to the estates that we're working, invite them to kintsugi groups, whatever it is. Let's build relationship and let's show the good news in action and communicate the love of God in that way. Do it through relationship, and our voice will be heard much louder. I still, you know, I have MPs sometimes, they ring you before question time going, oh, I've got a question about knife crime or something. And it's actually not because we're an expert on knife crime. It's because, you know what, they came to something and their heart was touched. And so I just encourage people, wherever you can, build relationship, and you'll be surprised by the results.
Yeah.
I think, sorry, Stuart, just to pick up there on, you know, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, I think the church was shocked when essential industries were kind of named and listed. You know, the church wasn't there, and the church was seen as non-essential in many ways. And I think that's probably a reflection of, you know, we are in a more post-Christian society. The church doesn't have that central role that it did in the past. And a lot of those kind of key functions that the church would have been involved in a pandemic like this in previous times, you know, have been kind of picked up by the state. But we do need to find a hearing, and doing these things battles those perceptions and transforms those perceptions that a lot of people in a post-Christian society do kind of have of the church. And we need to do these things deliberately. I think there's one or two other kind of strands from all of the earlier conversation. We need to create margin for leaders to be able to be proactive and deliberate about dealing with these changes, about thinking how to engage in the public square, around, you know, thinking around how do we reorganize ourselves and plan for a new normal and a new society, and that's a whole church responsibility, I think, but especially those in governance and leadership positions, is creating real margin for church leaders to proactively think and engage with these very important issues.
Thank you, Lawrence. I want to ask a couple of the questions that are coming up on the channel, and particularly one coming from Kate, I think. Our prayer through January has been about a challenge of capacity in prayers or people who live on the outlying islands, prophetic question mark. And I just want to make a comment first and then hand it over. I mean, what interested me in the work we did as a whole church during COVID has been reaching those that the government can't reach, communities that don't listen to the government. I think particularly people like asylum seekers is a good example. The body most connected to those who are disconnected is often the church and our mission. So it's so the question to you, to the panel, is really, what about the outlying islands, the lost and the least, as I think Patrick referred them to? What comments might you have there about how we show love in this season? I'm not going to say love your neighbour, because there's so many people doing that's untrue.
I think what I found, which I guess reflects this conversation about the research that you guys did, was the amount of people that said they didn't have any relationships that were significant with non-Christians, the lack of relationships. And that has to ask some big questions, doesn't it? Because fundamentally, if I've always thought that, what is poverty? What is these things? And I guess for me, I started to think that maybe poverty, I know it's a lack of choice, and I understand some of the traditional definitions of poverty, but I thought I heard this once, that poverty is a lack of friends. And what does that mean? And they were like, well, would you let your friend live in a cardboard box? Would you let your friend prostitute herself because that's the only way that she can bring in money for her children? And actually, it starts to make sense that there is a massive gap, and sometimes that and I think Peter's already said it about the way we do church, and the big conversation that needs to happen. How can we reimagine? And I said earlier that if we care for the most vulnerable in society, we'll end up doing what Christ called us to do. And so I think this is a huge issue, and as we care for those on the margins of society, and it's got to be, how do we connect, how do we build relationship? If we're just hanging out with Christians all the time and putting on more Christian events, doing more Christian things, as fantastic as that is needed, we've got to not lose the mission of God. And it's not like the mission of God means that we all have to be fixed to go out, it's actually, Isaiah 58 is, as we go and care for the poor, the marginalized, the broken, then that is the best thing we can do for our well-being. In fact, they say the best thing that you can do for your mental health is to be kind to people, kind to yourself and kind to others, and that changes things. And I say the most kind thing you can do to someone is to tell them about the love of Jesus. My issue is just how, and I think Jesus used story, and I think that's a beautiful place to start, is to use our story and his story.
I'm going to ask one last question because I'm conscious of time, and it really it's on the Q&A channel, which I hadn't realised we were using, but it basically goes, does any of the panel want to suggest some longer term 2, 3, 5 year ahead trends and shifts they expect to come from what we're seeing? So this is our third survey. What do we think we'll be saying? What do we think the trends are slightly going forwards? Particularly challenging question, but often a good place to end. Samuel.
Yeah, great question. Obviously, the results are so contingent on the circumstances, and those are changing so dramatically. I would say that the one thing that is consistent, and I would suggest is to move to online tools, online processes, and just becoming more just the need for the church to become more tech savvy, to put it into those terms. I would say that is the most consistent, the most likely trajectory from the data that we're seeing.
Patrick?
I would say, if you look at the two bigger cultural trends, if I'm allowed to do that, for saying, like, in terms of sort of a secular trend and an individual trend, I think those have been exposed. The secular is no space for God in the public square, etc. Actually, during the pandemic, what we realized was, look, science doesn't have the answer, politics doesn't have the answer, and people were interested in death because those figures were constantly before us, in the spiritual, in the something more than in life. And the other big trend is the profoundly individual. We're highly individual creatures. Even those of us who go to church, our whole church experience is shaped by, what did you get out of it? Did it speak to you today? How was the worship for you? But yeah, we discovered again that we're not anywhere near as individual as we thought. Once we were locked off in our homes and communicating only through screens, we're highly relational. So those are both really encouraging. I think people do want more, and they realize there's more to life in relationships. Those are the massive opportunities. I've already said the pastoral and the prophetic is where I see that going. But we also have to acknowledge that on the face of it, this data says we'll be a smaller church because habits have changed. Some who nominally attended have gone. Some who had those habits have had them broken. We're going to have to work really hard to re-engage. But the re-engagement will be about a relationship with Jesus and encountering the presence of God rather than the habit of simply turning up. But there's a whole lot in behind that in terms of discipleship and mission. And I do think the online's a challenge, because I think we've seen the first round of that. Currently, what most online church looks like is essentially a live stream of the service. That's like Web 2.0. I'm not super tech savvy, but I'm interested in this. I'm not wanting to do virtual reality church, or at least I have huge questions. That's the next layer and level of that. But I think it goes back to, what does an embodied experience look like? You know, that is a whole series of layers I'd love to unpack, but fundamentally it raises huge challenges, not just for the church, but for culture at large, as to how we do work, how we do relationships, how we do life. From the cryptocurrency, are we tipping into a fully online world? And actually, I don't think we do all want that. And that's really interesting. So those raise really profound questions for us to wrestle with. But actually, fundamentally, we know some of the answers, and that we're made in the image of relational God. We are wired for relationships. It's absolutely core to who we are. The biggest driver of well-being is relationships. That's no surprise. You could do endless research, and people have, and they found that answer. And we're like, yeah, funnily enough, God told us that right in the beginning. Let's lean into that space. And people do want there to be something more than life. The scientific answer that I'm just a random collection of cells, that my relationship with my wife or my kids is a biological reaction to further the next generation. That's awful if that's true. I want there to be something more, and most people do. Those are phenomenally positive touch points of engagement that I'm interested in the signposting towards the something more, the Jesus story. I'll stop my preaching, ranting there, but I'm excited about this moment amongst the challenges it also creates.
I'd rather if you've gone on for a long time more, but Patrick.
I think that at this time in history that we are, I think people do need to grieve well. And I think there is a way that we really need to allow people to lament. And I think grief isn't necessarily a set stages that we go through. I think it's a lot messier than that. And it comes in waves. But people have lost an awful amount over these last couple of years. And I think people are just starting to realise, and I think the church has a role to play. I don't like people go, oh, it's an opportunity for the church, because I don't feel like think of death as an opportunity, but actually it's a time to be a gentle presence in people's lives. And I can see that going on for a number of years now. I think the other thing, the big question that people are asking is, who can I trust? People don't trust institutions anymore. So we're very distrustworthy of politicians, of the media, even charities, in the, and some of the scandals that have happened in charities and in the church, might I add as well. So people, who can I trust? And trust takes time. It takes time to build, and it's all about relationship, like what Peter was saying. But I feel, having researched a lot around resilience recently, I managed to interview Eva Schloss, who was Anne Frank's stepsister, and I asked her about the survivors in the Holocaust, and she said something I found so interesting, saying that the people that got through, the people that did, I guess, that are still living now, and have got these incredible stories to tell, were those that accepted the situation they were in, that it was hard. The people that died really quickly were the optimists. The optimists would go, I'm out by January, I'm out by Easter. Christmas and Easter came, and they were still there, and they died. Accept the situation that we're in. It's going to be tough for the next couple of years, I think. And I think that acceptance is the first step to healing. It's not about denial, and it's not about resignation. It's not about saying I quit. Acceptance is really important. But the second thing she said was then the people who adapted to the situation, and then thirdly, they never lost hope. And I thought that's actually a really interesting model, is accepting we're in a tough situation, adapting to it, and all what that means that we've been discussing. But we have a hope, and that is a good place to finish, that we do have a hope that is actually going to see us through in not just a thing, but in a person and a living relationship with God.
Well, that's just a perfect way to conclude. We've run out of time. I couldn't think of a better way of concluding than Patrick just went through. I'd like to thank everybody for their time attending. This will be distributed on YouTube, so you have access to the material and the webinar if you wish to watch it again. Thanks to the panel and Krish for kindly giving us the video. Thank you for all of your questions. Apologies if we've not managed to answer them. If you wouldn't mind, Peter, would you mind closing us in a prayer?
I'd love to.
Thank you.
Father, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for the gift of your word, for the gift of your church. Father, we are passionate about seeing your kingdom come. And Father, we engage in these stats and then these stories to understand better what's going on. Father, I pray for everybody on this call, church attenders, leading ministries, leading churches, organizations, just serving you in so many different ways. I pray your blessing on them in the various contexts in which they find themselves. Father, I thank you for the agencies and others who've helped us lead through this research and get us thinking and provoking us. But Father, all of us are here to serve your church, your bride in this moment. And we recognize the challenges, the need for grief and lament that Patrick has reminded us of. This has been an incredibly tough season. And yet at the same time, we always want to find our hope in you and look towards you. And we thank you for the gift of your son. And we thank you for the gift of your church in this season. And we pray that we will lay down ourselves to serve you in response to that. And so for everybody in the different places they find themselves, in ministries and ways in which we're operating, the various conversations that we're going to get to have today, Father, that we can look for those moments where we might listen a little differently, hear somebody telling us something a little differently, take that moment to speak into their lives, hearing from you, to agree to pray for them, to lean into that space, because we do want to see ultimately your kingdom come. People encounter you in a fresh way, and we pray for a fresh sense of your presence and move of your Holy Spirit, both in individuals, in church communities, and across our land. Father, we see a land that is crying out for something more. And so we pray that we as the church can respond, acknowledging that we haven't always got that right in the past, but always coming and saying we want to serve you and respond differently as we move forward. So come, Holy Spirit, just be with each of us in the places that we find ourselves now, in Jesus' wonderful name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Just want to make one comment, which was my last role was mainly in the Southern Hemisphere, and there it's not a post-Christian world. The biggest crowd I was in was 5 million Christians, and I do think, you know, if I was looking at trends, and if you look at the Chinese government, probably one of its greatest challenges is the increasing role of faith in its culture. So I just wonder whether, you know, there's an interesting journey ahead. I would say if you took the world as a whole, it's secularism that's under challenge. It's not our faith. We're growing rather nicely. Sorry to contradict you, Lawrence. I do apologize.
No, absolutely. I think, you know, in the context that we're in, we experience a certain reality, but there's a reality beyond that in the wider world. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everybody. And should we call it a day there? Thank you. Bye for now.